Hello, everyone. Oh, I'm good. How are you? Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I know we're all so excited today. My name is Margie Cook. I'm part of the team that brings you live from NYPL. There are many things that you can do with your time, so I'm grateful you chose to spend it here with us. I am so pleased to introduce tonight's conversation with journalist and author Irin Carmon, joined by leading expert in constitutional law and reproductive rights, Melissa Murray. And they're here to discuss Irin's new book, Unbearable, 5 Women and the Perils of Pregnancy in America. So you can find their full bios in your printed programs or on the event listings on the website. So in Unbearable, the inadequacy of maternal health care in the US is revealed. And that no matter who you are or what privileges you enjoy, nothing can guarantee your personal safety or security. And this book is truly a wake-up call. From its first pages, we follow 5 women navigating pregnancy, from the first positive test through joy, loss, and the unexpected. In a country where maternal care is at best indifferent and at worst willfully cruel, alongside the brave, outnumbered individuals striving to make it better. So Unbearable is at once a story of human connection, a harrowing expose, and a powerful call for solidarity, reminding us of our shared humanity, regardless of circumstances or choice. So for those of you here tonight, there will be a book signing after the event, and for our online audience, we'll drop a purchase link in the chat if we haven't already. And of course, if you have a New York Public Library card, which I assume you all do, you can, yes, I hope that's a yes. I hope you can also borrow the book for free. So before I turn it over, I'd love to tell you about some of our very exciting upcoming events this month, and next month, actually, I should say. Actually, these are all November. There's still time to register for our event with Tim Wu in conversation with Lena Khan on November 6th. They will discuss his new book, The Age of Extraction, in which the legal scholar and former White House official explores how today's tech giants extract wealth from ordinary citizens and widen America's class divide. On November 11th, we present Clint Bentley's new film, Train Dreams, an adaptation of the beloved novella by Dennis Johnson. Bentley will screen clips from the film and discuss his creative process. And on November 20th, we welcome Dr. Tom Frieden in conversation with Chelsea Clinton. The former director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention will share a life-saving blueprint for protecting your health and preventing future pandemics. So please be sure to register at nypl.org/live. We hope to see you there. And one last thing, when you entered the auditorium, you should have received an index card. Please use those cards to write down your questions, and a staff member will collect them during the program. And finally, Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Minaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you, our wonderful supporters and friends near and far. Thank you for that support, and thank you all again for being here. And with that, let's please welcome Irin and Melissa.
Shall we begin?
Yes, good evening, everyone.
It's great to see so many faces here tonight to talk about this fantastic new book, Unbearable. Let's go to the very beginning. I think everyone's origin story, if they're in the reproductive justice space, must be Samuel Alito. So let's start there. How did Justice Alito prompt you to write this book?
I want to thank my dear friend Sam, a champion of reproductive freedom.
And women.
And of women. So I was 8 months pregnant when the final decision in Roe v. Wade was handed down. I was, at that point, you and I were both covering the decision. When the leak broke, I was about to go live on MSNBC and got to scan it on my phone really fast. And had to react immediately in real time, overcome by the impact that this would have on the lives of millions of people. although I had been reporting on this for so long, nothing could have prepared me for the starkness of the decision, the way that it came out when it did. And when I had a chance to read more closely, there was something in particular that really jumped out at me in this decision. Look, there was a lot of bad, can I say shit? There was a lot of bad shit in it. But specifically, there was a cataloging of fetal development that was reciting the Mississippi law that was at issue in this case. This was a 15-week abortion ban, and of course the court went much further, as we all know, than just upholding this ban. And it included a recitation of fetal development. And one of the phrases that it quoted from the Mississippi law was, it talked about fingernails, like anybody who is familiar with anti-abortion rhetoric has heard this before. And then there was this one line that said something like, at 12 weeks, the fetus has, or the unborn child has, in all respects, taken on the human form. And as I read through the rest of the opinion, I could find not even a cursory recognition of the human form of the person carrying that fetus. No recognition of how even in the most joyous circumstances, pregnancy is a significant physiological, emotional, psychological, social, and economic burden and responsibility. It felt like Sam Alito was erasing me and everybody else who could be similarly situated, even though I didn't need an abortion. I felt like deep in my bones, which were being warped by the weight of my future child, and I felt a rage, and I looked down at those fingernails that had been, the fetus had fingernails, me too, Sam, and I had a life and a plan, and so did everybody else who was in a position to be pregnant or become pregnant. And so even though this law would not affect me, I felt an enormous solidarity and a fierce desire to draw out the connections between very different circumstances of pregnancy. And so I wrote a piece. It was called, I Too Have a Human Form.
Zing.
And it included a kind of week-by-week recitation of what pregnancy does to your body. And at the time,
That's a horror story, Irin.
My husband was at both births, and he went through the pregnancies very much at my side. He's like, I can't read this as a horror movie. Like, this is some body horror. And I was like, try living it, but also try living it against your will, which is what American women and people who can become pregnant were being constricted into. And so it began with this very embodied recognition of pregnancy. And it led me to a path to trying to see how also, beyond biology, how in culture and medicine and law, all of these different experiences of pregnancy had been torn asunder, and I wanted to figure out a way to draw out the connections.
So you've told a really fascinating story in the book of 5 very different women from Brooklyn all the way to Alabama, yet their stories are deeply intertwined. So can you give us just maybe a thumbnail sketch of each of them and sort of how they all kind of come together in what is truly a visceral experience of what it means to be pregnant at various points of pregnancy in this country right now?
Absolutely. So as I was figuring out I had the idea, I needed the story. And over the course of 3 years of reporting, these 5 people captivated me as human beings, filled me in some cases with outrage at how they had been treated, and also filled me with admiration at what they had overcome in some cases or what people around them had done in their honor. And so at the beginning of the book, the first section is called Life at Conception, get it? Because they were human beings before they became pregnant. We meet these 5 individuals.
Very novel concept.
I know, weird, right? So at the outset of the book, we meet Maggie Boyd. And interestingly, I meet Maggie Boyd in the introduction because I'm at a picnic at my daughter's preschool here in New York City. It was very important to me to write about our hometown because of the kind of complacency, the tendency to think that maybe this is only a red state story. And so here we are having a picnic before the kids are about to start school, and I'm surrounded by people that I have mostly not met before. And somebody asks me about this book I'm working on, and I'm like, I don't even know these people. Who knows? What do I say about this? And I said, well, it's about how you're treated when you're pregnant. And somebody says, like a child. And then somebody else says, like an animal. And then a woman who I learned was Maggie says, like a child animal. And she said it with such vehemence. And I knew that she was an artist. I knew that she was a beautiful ceramicist. But it was only later that I learned that through her eyes, that she was a Canadian person who had moved here for love. At the visa appointment, she imagined herself being asked, why would you move to New York? It was the beginning of the first Trump administration. And she thought, who would leave Canada but if for love? So we see her encountering the American medical system in its complexity, its bureaucracy, its cruelty, its inequality, and how horrific that is to her. At one point, they're explaining the American insurance system to her, and she bursts into tears. And I don't blame her.
Right, she doesn't understand the whole concept of a deductible.
Well, I don't either. No.
You were born here. Actually,
I was not born
you
here,
weren't.
But I've had my whole life to figure it out, and I understand it on paper. I understand that it's there to make you not give cost them
So
money.
Maggie is almost, sort of an avatar of an entirely different system.
Yes.
Of what could be.
What could be, yes.
An aspiration.
A more universal system.
So she's aspirational to some degree, or at least what she represents. There's Christine, who's also a New Yorker, but she's a woman of color. She's working class, and she has a very different experience at many of the same institutions in New York City that Maggie frequents. And they have wildly different experiences, but not entirely different experiences.
Yeah, so Christine, when we meet her, she is a single mother who is putting herself through college with 2 jobs. She's in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, where her family is from. And there's a hospital in her community, Woodhull Hospital, that is known for midwives, but that is also just a public hospital in the community. And she was born there. She gave birth twice there and had great experiences with midwives. And it's her expectation that she'll continue to have a great experience. I don't know if we wanted to get into this whole thing, but I think so Maggie and Christine, in many ways their experiences are parallel because they are looking for something in the American pregnancy care system that should not be so hard to find, which is that they're looking to be treated not as a statistic or be put on a conveyor belt, but as a human being. And they hope to find that through midwifery care, and they hope to find it in the community where they live. And over the course of the book, we learn just how hard that is to achieve in the cruel American system. And we see that both of them wind up needing emergency care, that both of them are rushed into C-sections at the same hospital 4 years apart. And do we want to go all the way through this story?
I don't want to spoil anything.
No, I mean, we can get into it, but maybe I want to lay out the other women too, if we can.
So let's talk about Yashika and Allison. So you speak of Yashika Robinson,
Yep.
who is someone I deeply admire. She's an abortion provider in Alabama. We testified before Congress together. In fact, after we gave this testimony, Mike Johnson, and this is years before he became Speaker of the House, congratulated both of us for being wildly articulate.
Need we say that Yashika Robinson is also black?
I think it was implicit.
Yeah, and
But
that's after
she
he was
is.
a total asshole to her on the stand. too.
But she's a wonderful provider. And again, she is an obstetrician gynecologist. She is an abortion provider, but she's also someone who cares very deeply about giving people choices in whatever mode of care that requires. She's contrasted with another woman living in Alabama, Allison Molman, who is a former student of mine from Berkeley Law, who is now a lawyer working in Alabama with the ACLU. And at the time, she was working with the Equal Justice Initiative in the book. But she's someone who's trying to get pregnant and having a difficult time accessing assisted reproductive technology in a state where the legislature has made it clear that life begins at conception.
So I really wanted to write about Alabama, and I really wanted to write about Dr. Yashika Robinson, because from the very beginning, it seemed to me that the connections that I was seeking to report on, which are naturally occurring in a person's life, that at a given time in your life, you might need different kinds of care, and you deserve to be treated like a human being regardless of the kind of care you're seeking. But that Dr. Robinson was already just living that, right? So this is somebody who was raised in poverty. Her mother struggled with alcoholism. They moved around a lot, but she was still the salutatorian of her class. I struggled in the audiobook with this word. She was the number two.
Salutatorian.
You probably were valedictorian.
I was third, and
it must have been a really, really, really good school.
I'm really bitter, actually, about it.
We didn't do that at my hippie school. There were only 20 of us. So she's somebody who became a mother twice in her teens and was told by many of the adults around her that she was a disappointment to them because they thought that she was so smart. But actually, it was the doctors who treated her during her pregnancy who treated her like a person and who weren't disappointed in her. And that actually made her want to become a doctor. Like every time I have something nice to say about a doctor in the book, I'm like, yes. Because that is why Dr. Robinson became the kind of doctor that she is, because there were people who supported her even when she didn't follow the script or because they wanted to punish her for falling into stereotypes of a young black mother. And so she manages to get through medical school as a mother of two. She begins providing abortions in Alabama, and at first she doesn't understand why it is that people tell her, don't say the word abortion, don't tell anyone you're doing this. Because she says, isn't this just part of obstetrics? And of course, there is an entire history of marginalizing violently and through legal means abortion care from the rest of care. But she is determined, even though it puts threats on her life, makes it challenging for her to do the rest of her practice, she's determined to provide medical care regardless of what her patients need. So she does deliveries, she does gynecological care, and for as long as it's legal in Alabama, she does abortions.
And when it stops being legal after Dobbs and after Roe falls, she immediately pivots. And the abortion clinic that she had been running, she decides to recast as a birth center where patients can get the kind of birthing care that they want, where she will spend time with them, where there isn't, like if someone needs to labor for 13 hours, like they can do that as long as they're progressing well and there's no danger. She wants to prioritize a good birthing experience. And the state of Alabama, which says that life begins at conception, which is ostensibly pro-life, starts regulating her birthing center out of existence, imposing the same kinds of regulations, requiring a certain width for hallways, requiring being able to use a stretcher, requiring admitting privileges, all of the things that earlier Alabama and other states had levied against abortion clinics, they're now levying against this birthing center, ostensibly because women deliver there and therefore it is a hospital and it has to be regulated as a hospital.
Right, and she has to go to court. And
this is where Allison comes in.
And Allison is her lawyer. This is how I encountered Allison in the reporting. In a sense, the entire system of maternal health care in Alabama gets put on trial because the ACLU starts explaining how it is that Alabama, by many standards, ranks last in the nation or is the highest in the nation for maternal mortality, depending on the year. They're one or two. Sometimes they're salutatorian of killing women who give birth. A real distinction. And so I think there are repeated examples of the Alabama parts of the book in which the lie of the so-called pro-life state is repeatedly exposed in different ways. And so Dr. Robinson is looking to partner with midwives, especially Black midwives who once had an unbroken tradition of providing health care in Alabama when Black women were barred from hospitals. It's a tradition that stayed alive in the Black community in the South much longer than in other communities because
This is
of
your
deprivation.
conversation with Al over fried oysters.
Me and Alan Montgomery.
So Al tells the story about how he was delivered at home by a midwife, and you're astonished because you know the history. You know that after the American Civil War, as the doctors became professionalized, they started driving out the faith healers and midwives and started professionalizing their practice. This is when the AMA comes online. It's also when most of the restrictions on abortion come online as well. It's not a coincidence. And midwives are kind of run out of business and underground, but not in the Black community. And as Al tells you, it's because his mother cannot be admitted to the hospital because she's Black.
And he immediately notes the irony. This is just a man I'm sitting next to at an oyster bar in Montgomery, where he asks me why I'm in town. And through his life, I hear the entire American story. He says to me, oh, they're trying to make them go to hospitals, right? They're trying to make birthing people go to hospitals in this case that I'm here to hear, to witness the hearing. And he says they wouldn't let my mother in the hospital, and now they're trying to make them go to hospitals. And so I talked before about how Alabama represented some of the worst and also some of the best of American history. The stain of American history, of slavery, is deeply wrapped up in the history of obstetrics and gynecology. And so when I was trying to understand how it is that pregnancy healthcare in America was so warped and how these different experiences of reproductive healthcare had been torn asunder, it was linked to the very roots of reproduction in America. It began with the experimentation on enslaved women by the so-called father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims, whose statue is still outside the Alabama state capitol.
So there's actually an interesting symmetry between New York City and the Alabama Capitol because J. Marion Sims's bust used to be on a plinth just across Fifth Avenue from the Museum of the City of New York. It has since been removed, but it was controversial when it was removed. And he is known as the father of modern obstetrics, but his entire practice was on enslaved women.
Enslaved women who had no access to pain medication, who were held in his care for years because their so-called owners wanted them to be able to have more forced laborers. And so he was treating them for obstetric fistula with no regard for their pain or their autonomy because they wanted to create more laborers. And this was the interest in Black women's reproduction. And I think, it shapes the inequalities that we're talking about today. And yeah, so they took down the bust here in New York City. He went from Alabama here. He was sort of the link, too, between New York and Alabama in the book. But about 1.5 miles from J. Marion Sims's statue is an alternative memorial, and that is the Mothers of Gynecology. And we know 3 of the names of the women who were experimented upon and who also were forced to assist in this work, and who the historian Deirdre Cooper Owens refers to as the Mothers of Gynecology, and the artist Michelle Browder has picked up this mantle. They are these stunning, enormous statues made of metal scrap. They're known, and we know 3 of the women's names, Betsy, Anarcha, and Lucy. And they stand proud and unbowed, but harmed. There's pieces of their body that are missing. And so when Dr. Yashika Robinson, with the help of her lawyer, Allison Molman, goes to announce that she's suing the state of Alabama in order to open up more options of safe birth for the women left behind by the medical system, she stands in front of the mothers, and here she is, a black woman, an obstetrician gynecologist who is trying to take the best parts of the traditions of midwifery with contemporary science and medicine, with the acknowledgement of this history. And I found that very powerful and very moving. I then learned that Allison, who was standing beside her, had the experience of living in our post-Roe reality that has exacerbated these existing inequalities, because she herself, as you mentioned, is desperately trying to become pregnant. She and her wife are using assisted reproduction. At first, they're trying to do artificial insemination at home, and she doesn't have trouble getting pregnant, but does have trouble staying pregnant. And it is during her first miscarriage that instead of being given the full range of medical options, her doctor flatly tells her that there's nothing that she can do for her, and she's left to suffer alone. And it's only a little bit later that she realizes that she's been abandoned because of Dobbs, that her doctor is so afraid of offering her medical treatment options for miscarriage that could resemble an abortion, that the chilling effect, even though legally there was no fetal heartbeat, as you know, these are arbitrary distinctions of law. They are not medical distinctions. So she finds herself driving for hours to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, to another shuttered abortion clinic where she can get that kind of care. And you mentioned, abortion providers. I always like to point out, you know this, that abortion was not illegal at the founding, that abortion bans are a 19th century artifact. And how did we get them? We got them from the likes of J. Marion Sims, the medical establishment that was seeking to drive midwives and other abortion providers. Midwives were the original abortion providers, seeking to drive them out of business and to control reproduction. And one of the mechanisms that they used to effect that was by preying on or capitalizing on eugenic fears of immigrants reproducing and outnumbering our women.
This is the precursor of the Great Replacement theory. So during this period following the American Civil War, where the United States is experiencing an uptick in immigration from parts of Europe, Southern Europe, people are worried that the character of the nation is changing with these new migrants. And more importantly, it arises at the same time that American-born women are looking around saying, like, wow, you can die having a baby. Maybe I'll limit myself to 2. And so American families are becoming smaller. The industrial age is happening. People aren't living agrarian lives. They don't need 10 children to harvest. And so they start contracepting and passing around sort of, herbal remedies to contracept, and their families are becoming smaller. And so it's like a perfect storm of one demographic increase while another is declining, and they worry that America's not going to be America anymore. And so this starts the whole move against abortion. It's also at the same time that you start seeing moves against contraception.
Right. Yeah, and we also start seeing moves away from a communal model of pregnancy care into the hands of self-credentialed white men who, one of the ways that they're seeking to prove that they are better than the other medical providers, than the midwives or the quacks, is that they will not provide abortions and that they will help increase the white race. I mean, this is a very explicit, one of the other fathers of gynecology, Horatio Storer, talking about, are we going to allow our country to be filled by aliens? I mean, it's very heavy-handed to be living through a second 19th century right now. Like, I would prefer not to repeat this history.
So can we, the last person in the book who we should talk about is Haley. And Haley really is just such an interesting avatar, because Haley's story is one that is actually older than I am. Like, her story is about the criminalization of pregnancy. She is someone who has used drugs intermittently throughout her life. She becomes addicted to opioids. And in Alabama, where she lives, that is now understood as chemical endangerment of a child, because life begins at conception, a fetus is a child. So she is, immediately after giving birth, she is drug tested and she is institutionalized. She's put in jail until...
They arrest her in her son's hospital room 6 days after she gives birth.
Right. This has been happening since the early 80s to Black women. And Dorothy Roberts, who is the mother of the modern reproductive rights and justice theory and practice has essentially told us for 30 years that what they do to Black women, they are eventually going to do to white women. And now it is happening. The opioid crisis has been the vehicle for it. It's different in kind. It doesn't feel quite as punitive, but it is really punitive.
So this is another distinction that Alabama holds. When pregnancy justice began tracking arrests for pregnancy-related outcomes, so they cast a wide net. It is any kind of charge that is related to conduct, specifically relating to pregnancy, right? Not that you're pregnant and you murder somebody, but being charged with a crime against your own fetus, for researching an abortion, for having a miscarriage that is considered suspect. But also for using substances, for being addicted,
for fighting. There was that case during the pandemic of the two women in Alabama who were involved in like a street fight.
A woman was charged for getting shot in the stomach during her pregnancy because she was adjudged to have brought it on herself. There are women in Alabama who have been arrested for chemical endangerment of a pregnancy who turned out not even to be pregnant. That is how punitive it is. So of the 400 charges just in the 2 years after Dobbs, that pregnancy justice tracked, 200 of them were in Alabama, 192 to be precise. And that is because Alabama has zealously prosecuted individuals who test positive for substances. And in the beginning, that included legally prescribed substances until it started ensnaring upper middle class white women, and they amended the law. But women were even being charged for taking pain medication that they'd been prescribed.
Like acetaminophen?
It's not unrelated. It's not unrelated. It's always
I'm building.
It has to be the woman's fault. Mm-hmm. It has to be the pregnant person's fault. I mean, the answer is, yeah, we're going there. But so I want to say that there is such a through line between these different women's stories because, as you say, I profile Dorothy Roberts in the book. The great Dorothy Roberts says herself, that this history of reproductive control has shifted according to the priorities of the government. Mm-hmm. So first it is wanting to increase the reproduction of Black women when it is in the service of empire. And then it is wanting to limit Black women's reproduction when it is considered a burden on the state. And then it is punishing Black women for allegedly creating those burdens. The so-called super predators, the pseudoscience, there's nobody who's saying that it is an excellent indicated thing to use substances during your pregnancy, but we now know that addiction is not a matter of personal choice. It's a physiological illness. But it was Black women who were criminalized during the 1980s and stigmatized for drug use. I mean, I went back and I was reading in the archives the way that this was written about at the time. Black women were being accused of using crack as an abortifacient. Mm-hmm. Or to induce labor. They were being accused of having 15-second labors the moment they smoked crack. The babies were accused of having no affect. People were told not to pick up the babies, which is a horrific thing to do to a newborn. We know that human beings need touch when they're born. And this was all framed as Black women's bad choices leading to costly burdens on the state. So what happens in Alabama? When there is a meth epidemic, an opioid epidemic follows, a prescription opioid epidemic, they pass this chemical endangerment of a child law on the theory that what they say, they purport that this is because people are taking their children to meth labs and that this is a child abuse law. Well, very quickly, prosecutors realize that they can charge pregnant women with crimes of child abuse against their own fetuses. And in 2013, this goes before the Alabama State Supreme Court because lawyers say, wait a minute, a fetus is not a person under Alabama law. How can you charge a woman against her own pregnancy? And the answer is that the Alabama State Supreme Court says, no, actually, for us, it is a child. And they specifically say that only Roe v. Wade holds us back from making this the consistent law of the land. And so then, Alabama voters vote in a personhood amendment to their constitution before Dobbs. Then Dobbs happens. It opens up the door so that when a mentally unwell person somehow gets into a cryogenic freezer of embryos and drops them down on the ground. And the people whose embryos they were destroyed in that process, unforgivably, instead of just charging with neglect, end up,
Suing under wrongful death.
Wrongful death of a child. Alabama State Supreme Court bans IVF on the theory that, hey, we said it when it was drug addiction. Now we also made abortion illegal on the theory that a fetus is a person. The extrauterine child in the petri dish in the cryogenic freezer is also a child. And that is how, while Allison is trying to get pregnant, Alabama bans IVF. And so I always say that the right deeply sees the connections here. So people who oppose these kinds of restrictions also should see how deeply connected and the through line between the black women who were charged in the 1980s, and then I have the scholar Kiara Bridges talking about how somebody like Haley, who is white and working class and struggling with addiction, spends 2 months sleeping on a concrete floor in a jail full of pregnant women because as a white woman, now what was tested on black women is being used on her for, I think, failing to produce the perfect model of white womanhood and white babies. She is being punished for diverting from that. And it is deeply connected to the reasons and the very jurisprudence of how Alabama banned IVF.
Okay, let's widen the aperture a little bit and talk about right now. So we are in, as you say, an unusual moment where we seem headed back to the 19th century. Project 2025 was full of pronatalist notes that are now, I think, coming into fruition with this administration. We've already heard about proposals to incentivize women to have children, so maybe bonuses for babies. Sean Duffy, our former lumberjack, now Secretary of Transportation, has said that transportation funding should be directed at communities that have the highest rates of fecundity, so the highest birth rates.
Married fecundity.
Yes, married fecundity, excuse me. We are in a truly pro-natalist moment. And it strikes me that this isn't just about pregnancy and demographic change. It is also, and this is related to IVF, it's also about individuals in society no longer hewing to traditional roles in society. So it's women having jobs and deferring childbirth and maybe freezing their eggs and using assisted reproductive technology because they want to put career first or to make the decision about when to have a child on their timeline. That's a kind of gender bending that we don't ordinarily think of as gender bending, but I think they think of it as gender bending. It's defying and departing from a traditional sex role. Men who are wife guys, that's departing from a traditional sex role too, I guess. But we are seeing just this revanchism toward a traditional mode of men and women. And I think the assaults on the trans community are part of that, just like to render them absolutely invisible because they do not hew to that binary, but to reinstate a traditional model. So how does this attack on pregnancy, on birth, the shifting norms around how people come into this world relate to what feels like an effort to recall an earlier time when men were men and women were women?
Right, and women did all of the unpaid caregiver work. Yeah. And I mean, when you hear the nostalgia for the single male salary supporting a family, implicit in that is the unpaid labor of caregiving performed by women. So I think a truly pronatalist society, I honestly hate the way that word has been used and co-opted, would not be one in which pregnancy was coerced, in which reproductive freedom and justice were a theory rather than a practice, in which millions of people are about to get thrown off Medicaid and to not get access to SNAP benefits in mere days if things continue as such. A baby bonus sounds absurd only in a context of lack of choice, utter cruelty. 35% of American counties being classified as maternity care deserts, maternity practitioners and labor and delivery units being forced out of business every day, the US ranking at the top of the maternal mortality in the 10 richest countries in the world, regardless of how you crunch the numbers. And for every maternal death, there's 60 or 70 cases of maternal morbidity that result in hospitalization. Lack of postpartum support, lack of access to childcare, that's by design. They would like women to not be competition for white men in the workforce. Separating families, including babies. I wish pronatalist meant the opposite of what it is that they are prescribing, but I think it is very clearly a function of gender ideology, racial ideology, xenophobic ideology, and eugenic ideology, telling women not to use Tylenol because they are so obsessed with stigmatizing autism, falls within this tradition of policing pregnant people's choices and bodies. And we know that the roots of eugenics in this country is about punishing people with disabilities and their reproduction. And so I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times over the weekend about rejecting that notion of pronatalism and lamenting that it doesn't leave space for those of us who would like to and are joyfully choosing a different vision of pregnancy and parenting, which is not an inherently gendered one, not an inherently heteronormative, partnered, cisgender one, but one that involves the joyful bringing forward of new life and raising children in communities that are not coercive and punitive, in which pregnancy is not policed, but is supported. And I wish that that's what pronatalism meant, but listen, they're too cheap to even do the baby bonus that they floated. They're not going to get, the baby bonus is absurd because it's the least that they could do, and they're not even doing that. In other countries, there exist baby bonuses within a wraparound framework of care that, by the way, includes midwifery and access to abortion through the public hospital system, places like Canada. Sorry, Maggie, America sucks. But I always like to say that the unbearable does not need to be inevitable. Mm-hmm. This is our history, and these are choices that we have made. But I think first recognizing that history and that present, and rejecting this, that they are the ones who are pro-family, mm-hmm. and offering an affirmative vision of care, I think is the only way out.
So as part of offering a pro-family affirmative vision of care that challenges the sort of pronatalism, the sort of perversion of pronatalism that we've described, I think that's a cultural project. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea that culture all too often precedes policy. Like before you have a civil rights movement, you have the Harlem Renaissance, where people imagine what could be, and then the lawyers step in. The lawyers are remarkably unimaginative. Sorry.
You're the lawyer, not me.
I heal thyself. We are in an interesting cultural moment because it seems like the folks who are most invested in this kind of perversion of pronatalism are also deeply invested in cultural change. And so I want to posit to you that what seems like just a TikTok trend is actually a very subversive move to move culture in the direction that cultivates this kind of pronatalism. So has everyone heard of the trad wife? It's like, my husband said he would like a Coca-Cola, so I decided to make it from scratch.
I don't know. I'm of the opinion that that's kind of a kink that we're all being forced to watch.
Well, obviously I'm watching it. But I think this is so unbelievably invidious. And it's responding to something. I mean, like, the women who are trad wives were just 15 years ago teens and preteens watching their mothers work and go to a million PTA meetings and try to have it all. And they've decided, like, maybe there's a different way where you can just go back to sort of traditional mindsets, traditional gender roles,
yeah.
and now it's being glamorized, and it's being done in all parts. I mean, Black women have the soft life paradigm, which I think is a species of this, but it is about this kind of retrenchment to a traditional binary gender setup, a heteronormative family with traditional roles for everyone. And again, part of what I think is this pronatalist ethos that they would like for the entire country.
So the historian Stephanie Kuntz has a great book called The Way We Never Were.
Yes.
Which I think shows very powerfully the fantasy that we have of the 1950s or, the pre-20th century era of the family, of simple domestic life and a private sphere for a woman, and the public sphere and honest work for the father and raising children. The reality is women have always worked, paid and unpaid work, especially Black women. And this romantic notion of the separate spheres is much more a work of culture, as you say. I wish I had a citation for this, but I recently read something about, it was a sociology of why people consume tradwife content. They talk to people about why they do it. And I think it tells us something really important about why it is that that's resonated. And that is that it's not the traditional values, but it's the simplicity that people like. They like watching somebody work with their hands on a screen. They like the idea of having like one job and not 500 jobs and side hustles and caregiving and everything else that they're doing.
This is the pronatalist stuff. The guy with the one job who takes care of the family and the wife who does the one thing, takes care of the family.
So it was never that simple.
No.
But I understand why people want it to be, because of the sort of communal abandonment of family life, which is...
It's not just a communal abandonment, though. I mean, we've privatized all of this. Like, other countries don't do this. Like, when you talk about Canada, there's public support for families in a way that we just don't have here, because we have such antipathy for the prospect of redistribution.
Right.
And that's at the heart of all of this.
Yeah. And, at the outset, you asked me about New York, and I just want to finish answering the question from before, because the inequality that we tolerate as a result for our distaste for redistribution is at the heart of the New York stories in the book. So when Maggie goes to her local hospital, it does not occur to her that there is a vast difference between the public hospital in a low-income part of Brooklyn and the hospital down the road from here. And it does not occur to her that the doctors there get paid less, that there are fewer nurses, that they don't have the same advanced equipment, that they are constantly in an emergency mode. And this is the kind of care that is the default, right? So when I talked about the American maternal mortality rate, I'm not sure I had a chance to mention that here in New York City, Black women are likelier to die than white women at higher rates than the national average. And during the events that I write about in the book, it was, so the national average, depending on the year, the gap, Black women are 3 or 4 times likelier to die than white women in childbirth or pregnancy-related reasons in the country at large. Between, I believe it's 2000 to 2018, the number at various times was between 9 and 12 times. Black women are 9 and 12 times likelier in New York City to die than white women. And it is precisely because of the inequalities. We're in one of the most beautiful buildings in all of New York City. We tolerate a Gilded Age on steroids inequality right here in New York City, where there is significant research showing that the hospitals where Black women go and the fundamental disinvestment in their care contributes to that gap. And so I think people have a fantasy of a simpler time because, in part, our present has left them feeling abandoned. And it's the wrong answer to a question that is legitimate.
So there are a number of great questions for the audience, A+. Please come to NYU. You'd be very welcome. I think this relates to what you just said. What do you make of Gen Z's right turn, and why don't they seem more enraged about the prospect of forced birth and pronatalism?
So I think we've talked about the cultural appeal already. I also think, and I'm not, I think, is Gen Z moving to the right, or are they consuming a lot of right content? I mean, there's certainly more of them voted for Trump, I suppose, than they did before, but we also, depends which Gen Z you're talking about and where. But I do think that and on what issue? There is also a phenomenon happening when it comes to forced birth, which is that the pre-Roe reality of illegal abortion, where women were filling septic wards, is not happening because of an incredible advancement in technology, and that is, of course, medication abortion. And so there's data from Aid Access, one of the largest groups of people who are doctors in blue states writing prescriptions legally in their own states for medication abortion, and through telemedicine, mailing them to states where abortion is illegal. And the data shows that in recent months, one group alone, Aid Access, has been sending out 14,000 pills a month, 80% of them to banned states, states where abortion is illegal, thus making invisible the burdens that people are experiencing, and actually showing that there is so much more demand, even in blue states, for abortion than we even knew, if you create an opportunity to access the care privately without going through a clinic where everybody's yelling at you, without having to call. Honestly, from what I hear from talking to advocates, sometimes it's just picking up the phone. This is a stereotype about Gen Z, that picking up the phone is terrifying, but also because there's significant stigma, because you might be a young person, because, and the post-Roe reality, the post-DOPS reality, we expected would be people traveling across state lines, and it is happening. And we expected that it might be the kind of archetypal horror of the coat hanger. But this incredible advancement is putting options in the hands of people who wouldn't have had it otherwise. And if it goes away, I worry about what we might see, but I think it is also blunting the outrage, because people are actually accessing abortions in red states in ways that we cannot see, because very few of them end up coming to the attention of the law.
Well, I also think another way that the outrage is blunted is that we saw so many of these ballot measures in states that gave people, I think, a sense that they had some control over this, maybe an illusory sense of control.
At least in purple states, yeah.
Yeah. That's a really interesting observation about the shift to medication abortion and just sort of limiting the outrage of all of us, I think. Maybe we should be more exercised on this.
But also there's manufactured and real crises every day. And so I think that a lot of these things are happening privately because they're outside of the law.
Well, I mean, it is, again, so on our podcast, Strict Scrutiny, we talk about this all of the time. Like, we started off just being enraged about abortion. Now we're enraged about everything. And, we actually don't know where to sort of turn next. With that in mind, a very astute audience member notes that we did actually make it out of the 19th century. Are there lessons that we might take from our shift from the 19th century to modernity that we could apply today to get out of this revanchist moment?
Well, it took a very long time, didn't it?
It was a long 19th century.
It took a lot of false starts. It took, passing of civil rights laws. It took blood and sweat and tears, and it took litigation, it took activism, it took everything, all of the above strategies. I was thinking a lot about, as we watch the Trump administration dismantle so many of the programs that, what safety net we did have, what support for evidence-based research we did have, what access to health care we have had. It takes so long to build this, and it takes so little time for them to destroy it. But what I hope is that we can have some clarity about what wasn't working before, and that we can have some vision about how to rebuild out of the ashes.
So I think I think right now feels very much like a nadir, just like the absolute bottom, and it feels almost hopeless. And I think one of the things that gives me comfort right now is sort of recognizing that these are the moments where you plant seed corn, where you sort of imagine the possibilities and you start building toward whatever that new possibility is. That's the only kind of thing that can happen in the abyss.
You're right, and I think that that's actually what is really powerful about you made me think of two of the people in the book. Dr. Robinson, because of course it was already the nadir in Alabama in so many ways for so long. So now we're kind of all living under a national Alabama. We are in some way protected by being here in New York City, but I actually think it is really powerful to talk to people who have stayed in these places that have already experienced the rolling back or never experienced the benefits of some of the advances of the second half of the 20th or the middle of the 20th century. So the fact that they can keep going, I think really gives me hope that somebody like Yashika Robinson can have to turn her patients away, but stays there where she could go anywhere because she wants to serve the patients that she has. And I write about also Jose Perez, who is the surviving partner of Christine Fields, who tragically loses her life in a totally preventable way due to medical neglect and malpractice at Woodhull. And the fact that this one person experiencing so much loss while trying to raise his 3 children, while trying to also get them back into the home that they've been kicked out of, has continued to work towards a better reality, is training medical students and actually just trained as a doula, is protested outside of Woodhull every single week with a jacket that said Woodhull murdered Christine Fields, is willing to come back to Woodhull to support families in birth. And so I just feel like there are so many people who have already lost so much and are still showing up.
We have to show up too.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a very active audience. Some of these audience members are big Irin Carmon fans, and they've...
Why, thank you.
And they've been with you from the beginning. It's exactly 10 years since Irin's best-selling book with our
Shauna Knižnik.
Yes, an NYU law student, the Notorious RBG. So this is a delicate question, I think. Have your feelings about the Notorious RBG changed in light of Dobbs and the shift that we've seen on the court?
Well, I think that you asked about the Notorious RBG, and of course there's Notorious RBG, the phenomenon, which strikes me as a product of a more innocent time, where feminism was the zeitgeist and not trad wives. Maybe one day it'll come back. It was an optimistic time. But I also always want to remember that when Shauna nicknamed her the Notorious RBG, it was in response to a dissent that she wrote
in Shelby County
versus Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act and was a warning of what was to come. It's also interesting to me, it's obvious that Justice Ginsburg should have retired before the Democrats lost the Senate, when Obama was still president, but which was before Notorious RBG came out. But the same ways that she became the Notorious RBG, that stubbornness, that refusal to listen to anybody else when they told her it was impossible, also led her astray in this respect. At the same time, I think there's also a temptation to blame somebody who actually devoted their entire life to reproductive freedom in all of its senses, including fighting eugenic sterilization, including fighting for people who wanted to stay pregnant. That the person who tried to prevent it the most, it is, of course, a tragic irony that she would be replaced by, an haute trad wife. But we also know that John Roberts also voted to uphold that law, that the retirement of Anthony Kennedy was the dispositive vote change, and that when we hear about these decisions that erode democracy, that further erode voting access, and the overturning of Roe v. Wade, they are 6-3 decisions. And so while Justice Ginsburg should have retired it is so much bigger than any one person's decisions, and it's very tempting to say it was all her fault. And people are justified in being angry. But I think the depth and the scope of the shit we're in is so much bigger than one individual or even than just the Supreme Court, because none of this would have been possible without 2 Trump elections. And that was, for better or for worse, a democratic process. And so there are some terrible, if she had hung on a couple of extra months, Joe Biden could have appointed her successor. I know she wanted to be there to undo the damage. But, unfortunately, our problem is much bigger than yelling at an old lady who waited too long to retire.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Also worth noting, for someone who was the victim of unrelenting gender discrimination in much of her career, I'm not surprised when she reached the apex of her career that it was hard to let go. You are one person, one individual. How are you planning to use your voice and your prodigious talents over what looks like a nadir that will be lasting, at least for the next 3 years or so, to make sure that we have the seed corn we need to move out of this on the other side?
I'm going to keep reporting. I'm going to keep asking people about the worst times in their lives and making everybody read about it. I'm going to look for people who know history, because we need the history, and people who have ideas about the future. I definitely don't have the answers. I think I'm fundamentally a reporter who has a passionate lens on what is right, but I feel really inspired by getting to talk to people who have vision for something better. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in pregnancy is because pregnancy is ultimately about transformation, whether you choose to carry one to term or not. It is about a deep, visceral change in your life, one way or another. And so perhaps we can all be pregnant willingly with a vision of a better country, but it's not on any one individual. I got to punt on that, sorry.
All right. The book is called Unbearable, 5 Women and the Perils of Pregnancy in America. And the talented, prodigiously talented author is Irin Carmon.